Hello, my name is Spencer, and in my podcast called The Dictionary, I literally read from the dictionary, but add in my personal comments and stupid jokes to make it more interesting. Episodes are family-friendly, short, and air every single day on basically every podcast platform. Come join me on this journey filled with edutainment.
Hello and welcome to How Did This Not Get Made?
This is the podcast all about the movies you never saw, the scripts that were never filmed, and the ideas that never even made it to the page. My name is David Spencer.
And my name is Daniel Kaka. And we're back for part 2 of Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon.
Yes, indeed.
The first episode we talked about mostly Stanley Kubrick, the rise in his career. Parallel to that, we learned about Napoleon and his rise in the ranks as a military officer and why he gained so much power so early on. And that's mostly because he was just ruthless and just didn't care about anyone else. I'm for France, and I will kill anyone that'll get in my way, literally.
And now we're going to watch it all come crumbling down?
Yeah, I mean, we will. Yeah, let's just jump back into the script. But before we get into the script, we are going to take a little break. I know we just got started, but I can't find a convenient place to do this. So we are going to put some ads in right here.
Hey!
Yeah.
We're back from that convenient ad.
And we're going to continue on with the story about Napoleon.
Yes.
What we see on the screen, which actually, because I had you watch Barry Lyndon.
Yeah.
And the thing that I got out of Barry Lyndon was like they had the title screens telling you where you were.
Mm-hmm.
Napoleon, this script, does the same thing. And this is how I'm going to refer to it as. It's just going to be title, the first Italian campaign. But know that when you're watching it in the movie, all you see on screen is the first Italian campaign.
Yes.
Napoleon leads 5,000 French soldiers on an Italian road. Napoleon gives an inspiring speech to the armed men. The narrator explains that Napoleon and his tactics changed how war was fought, and his strategies are what led him from victory to victory. Mm-hmm. Napoleon would sacrifice supplies and encourage living off the land to increase mobility. He gave the soldiers a sense of nationalism and pride, whereas other armies did not trust their soldiers. A long shot shows the French army opposite of the Austrian army. Napoleon's voiceover explains his mentality during battle, coming to the conclusion that the simplest moves are always the best. The French army easily defeats the Austrians in battle. The French army triumphantly marched into the streets of Milan. Napoleon is praised for his victories. Josephine and Napoleon make love in the bedroom of the Milan palace. In voiceover, Josephine explains how bored she is. She doesn't believe that Napoleon loves her, but instead worships her, and her affair with Charles may have been found out. In the next scene, Hippolyte Charles meets with Napoleon in his office, thanking him for safely escorting Josephine from Paris to Milan. Charles is told to return to Paris and leaves the room. Napoleon reveals a letter that states that Josephine has been having an affair with Charles and shares it with his brother Joseph and Junot. He asks them if they can confirm the allegations, in which they both deny. Title: Egypt. On July 2nd, 1798, Napoleon arrived in Egypt with an army of 40,000 men. This was his attempt to block England's access to India. Napoleon, Eugene, Junot, Marmot, and Murat, accompanied by a large party of scientists, stand before the Sphinx. The mummy is brought out of the tomb to be inspected. Explained by the narrator, quote, Napoleon took along 150 distinguished scientists, intellectuals, and artists equipped with libraries and scientific instruments. They would found the Institute of Egypt to the preliminary survey work for the Suez Canal and unlock the key to hieroglyphic writing. I don't exactly know the history of like going into Egyptian pyramids and like studying them, but it seems like Napoleon was one of the first people to do that.
Yeah, I always thought of that as like early 20th century thing. I didn't realize that Napoleon was Tomb Raidering it up.
Was already grave robbing.
Yeah.
In the next scene, the French divisions is being attacked by the Mamluk cavalry. Inside the square are the scientists and intellectuals along with Napoleon and a small group of officers. The Mamluks are getting slaughtered by the French riflemen posted on the outskirts of the square. Napoleon goes to the scared scientists and intellectuals to reassure them that they are safe. This is actually quite a funny scene because they're trembling in fear and Napoleon's like, nothing to fear here, we got this, and just completely cocky about the situation and be like, it's
That's
just
funny.
Battle, you guys. You'll be fine. No one gets harmed in battle.
Don't worry about it.
At night, we see the Murad Bey mansion has been captured by the French. An orgy can be heard taking place somewhere in the mansion. Many of the officers are partaking except Napoleon, who's working on his makeshift office, and he is irritated.
The sex and orgies in this script is just ridiculous.
So casual.
There's a certain kind of, ooh, yeah, we're going to put sex in this movie and be like edgy, or I guess edgy wouldn't have been the purpose at the time, but there's just something about it that just feels like you don't have to be making the movie this way, Stanley Kubrick.
No, but he wants to. But
yeah,
he doesn't really need to. A very drunk Junot enters the office. Napoleon has received a letter stating that his brother Joseph has not been giving Josephine money to support her. Junot explains that Joseph is looking out for his best interests. Junot confesses that he was the one that wrote the letter that Josephine was having an affair with Charles, saying that he heard them together at an inn while they were traveling. Captain Borin enters with urgent news that Captain Burries is dead, and they've lost about 11 ships at Epilogue. Napoleon returned to the port of Fréjus in France in October 9th, 1799. He is welcomed by a celebrating French city, while the narrator explains that he evaded a large British fleet in France, was in the midst of economic chaos, and was under threat of invasion. At Luxembourg Palace, Napoleon sits before 5 directors, Barras, Saïs, Moulins, Goyer, and Roger Ducos, all formally dressed with 3-foot-tall feather-plumed hats. Napoleon and Goyer discussed that his army was abandoned in Egypt after the ships at Epilogue were destroyed. Napoleon assures them that they'll be fine, that they're set up for in a great position to defend themselves under the leadership of General Kleber. Although for some time, Napoleon and his armies had their communications cut from the Epilogue attack. Napoleon learned much later that France's loss of Italy, the Anglo-Russian army's occupation of Holland, and the imminent invasion of France. Because of the threat, Napoleon thought it'd be best to return to prevent more loss. Soon after Napoleon's return, there was a shift in power. Saïs and Roger Ducos remained as directors, but the other 3 were replaced with Talleyrand, Joseph Bonaparte, and Napoleon. In a scene with Joseph and Napoleon driving around in a carriage, they discuss Napoleon's separation with Josephine. Joseph thinks that it's not the best time, and Napoleon thinks that it doesn't matter. The nation already knows of her affair, and he doesn't want to allow her back in the house. In the next scene, we see Napoleon and Josephine post-coital. Napoleon appears depressed. Napoleon asks if Josephine was in love with Charles. She says that she thought she was, but now she's only in love with Napoleon. As a double standard, Josephine asks if he had sex with other women. Without hesitation, he admits to it, but he said that it was different. He was never in love with them. Josephine pleads with Napoleon never to leave her. Title: Coup d'etat. Over the next 3 weeks, a conspiracy to overthrow the government unfolds, and on November 10th, Napoleon would have supreme power over France. Delbrel, the leader of the Jacobin Party, gives a speech to the deputies, explaining the new dynamics of the government. The 5 directors would be replaced with 3 consuls, Napoleon, Saïs, and Roger Ducos, giving them executive and administrative power. They'll also be writing a new constitution. For a month, Lucien Bonaparte was given the role of president until his brother returns. Napoleon, Saïs, and Roger Ducos wait in the Saint-Claude Salon, formerly Marie Antoinette's reception salon. Major Lavalette enters the room with a message from Lucian stating that the proposal will not go to vote. They will either save themselves or use the troops immediately against the angry deputies. Saiz and Roger Doku are freaking out while Napoleon remains calm. If they don't act, they will be voted out of government and most likely executed. Napoleon enters the Orangerie, guarded by 4 grenadier guards. The deputies demand for him to withdraw. As he makes his way to the podium, a fight breaks out and he's knocked to the ground. Outside the Orangerie, Napoleon, with a bloody face, mounts a horse and rides it through the crowd of soldiers, all of them shouting, "Long live Bonaparte." From the inside, the deputies hear the cries of the crowd grow louder and louder until they burst open the door. Captain Marut informs them that they have been dissolved. The deputies scurry out of the chamber, some through the windows, as the narrator states, quote, "At the age of 30, Napoleon would be the #1 consul and head of the executive for a period of 10 years, and the 2 consuls would become merely figureheads." Title: Empire. A small-scale model plots out the coronation ceremony for Napoleon in a cardboard mock-up of the Notre Dame Cathedral. From the narrator, we are informed that Napoleon's rule for the next 5 years has been beneficial for the state of France. He created enduring government institutions, he revitalized the economy, ended the religious rebellion in Vendée. He was also open to bringing the best minds of the revolution to help him govern. In my research, I did find out that Napoleon, in his revolution of France, he is the reason for high schools.
Oh, interesting.
And why they're separate from like middle and a lot of primary schools.
That's cool.
Yeah. He modernized France, and in exchange, he was given more power over France than any monarch before him. At Notre Dame, at his coronation, the Pope crowned Napoleon with the crown of Charlemagne, and on December 2nd, 1804, Napoleon was made Emperor of France. At a dinner with Madame Trullaud, her husband, and Josephine, Napoleon explains his mentality towards governing, stating that most people blame the institutions for corrupting society, but instead it's man's selfishness and greed when put in a position of power that will end up corrupting them. You don't destroy an established government, but instead tinker with it to create a utopia. Napoleon attempts to pour Madame Trullaud some more wine, but it spills on her dress. He insists to help clean it up, and they leave the room. Josephine has seen this move before. Napoleon and Trullaud are going at it, and they are interrupted by Josephine knocking at the door. She knows what's going on and asks him to come back to dinner. Napoleon denies her accusations and tells her that he is busy. The mood is ruined, and Madame leaves. That night, Napoleon is upset with Josephine. She's crying while Napoleon tries to make the point that he should be free to do whatever he wants. Napoleon states that he will be getting a divorce, and from now on, they should sleep in separate rooms. Later that night, Napoleon enters Josephine's room to apologize for being upset, and she apologizes for reacting like she did, and to no longer embarrass him again. In their last exchange, it's implied that Josephine will be going to the waters of Plombières to give birth. In a field, we see George III with his British troops and spectators. The narrator explains that since 1069, France and England have been at war for 152 years, and since 1338, the kings of England also appointed themselves the kings of France. Napoleon had them drop the title in the peace treaty of Amiens. It only took a year for England to declare war on France and fight for maritime supremacy. On a bluff overlooking the English Channel, the English fleets placed themselves on the sea while Napoleon and his French troops set themselves up on land. Napoleon's plan is to lead the British fleet to the West Indies so that his ferry of troops could cross the channel, but that failed, which left 2 French ships at the bottom of the sea. England, at this time, also developed an alliance with Austria and their Emperor Francis II, who is only a year older than Napoleon, and Russia and their 29-year-old Tsar Alexander. In a short scene, we see the aftermath of the defeated Russians at the Battle of Auschwitz and a weeping Tsar Alexander. This is happening around December 1805. At the French headquarters of Auschwitz, Francis II, who led the Austrian army in alliance with Russia, is brought in to speak with Napoleon after being defeated. They talk formally, and Francis admires Napoleon for his victory. As a joke, Napoleon asks if he's wearing warm winter underwear, seeing that he is freezing, and Francis states that he is not. He proceeds in saying that the first rule of warfare is wearing long underwear. In a scene, we see Prussian noble guards sharpening their swords on the steps of the French embassy in Berlin. The narrator explains that Prussia, led by Queen Louisa and King Frederick Wilhelm, will now be taking on Napoleon after the defeat of Austria and Russia. We see Napoleon enjoying the opera Don Giovanni. He's handed a note that reads, "Prussian ultimatum delivered to me by Haugwitz. War is now imminent. Talleyrand." The narrator lets us know that Prussia would make the same error as Austria, and they would be destroyed by Napoleon's army. Tsar Alexander was determined to take on Napoleon as well. At the Niemen River, Tsar Alexander met with Napoleon. From the narrator, Alexander would be forced to sue for peace. The two of them look over a map to divide their territories. They bring up the fact that they were only at war because Russians are allies with England, and for Alexander, he's only received false promises from them and left them to fend for themselves while fighting their battles. For the next 2 weeks, the two leaders hung out every day to talk about philosophy, women, politics, war, science, etc. They had become good friends, and in a voiceover, Napoleon admits that if Alexander were a woman, he would have fallen in love with him. But there was something lacking. We get a scene of the two of them in a sauna bath, with Napoleon giving Alexander tactical advice. The next scene, Napoleon is in the bathtub as Talleyrand sits next to him with draft notes on the Treaty of Tilsit. In the treaty, it states Alexander would act as a mediator between France and England. Talleyrand is skeptical of Alexander and thinks he's impressionable and will follow the orders of the last person who has his ear. But Napoleon is confident in him and their friendship. The next day at Niemen River, Napoleon and Alexander formally leave their territory and agree to only deal directly with each other from there on. Title: The Fall. At the Tuileries throne room, an imperial divorce procedure between Napoleon and Josephine is underway. The reason that is given is that she was unable to bear children. After the ceremony, Josephine was left at the Malmaison. She has dinner alone, while Napoleon is at the Tuileries ballroom with friends and a trio of musicians where Napoleon is learning to waltz from Marat. At the Austrian embassy reception in Paris, the Austrian ambassador, Schwarzenberg, enters muddy and bloody. He tells Duroc, who has been waiting for him, that he fell during a hunting trip. Duroc is there to tell him that Napoleon has decided to marry Austrian's Archduchess Mary Louise. April 1st, 1810. A wedding ceremony was held at Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. Napoleon was unable to attend his own wedding. Archduke Charles, which is Marie Louise's uncle, stood in place for him. She is presented with a letter from Napoleon, a portrait of him in a medallion surrounded by 12 extremely large diamonds. Marie Louise is taken by carriage through a storm to be taken back to Napoleon. As Caroline, Napoleon's sister, and the Queen of Naples, they go over the procedures with Marie Louise before she arrives. But then Napoleon interrupts their ride and boards the carriage to surprise his wife. Turns out they would have never actually seen each other in person prior to. That night, Napoleon tries every move to consummate the marriage, but is constantly interrupted by Marie Louise. Turns out she's a virgin and was given no instructions as to how to be intimate with a man. Napoleon proceeds to tell her a joke about two virgin boys that visit a brothel. One boy is timid and does not enter while the other goes in. When he returns, the timid boy asks what it was like, and he replies with, quote, "The movements were ridiculously simple, but the feeling is wonderful." Napoleon and Mary Louise laugh at the joke and make love. Months later, Napoleon is holding up his infant son, the King of Rome, from the Tuileries balcony for the crowd to see. A year later, we see Josephine carrying the year-old King of Rome and showing him the Malmaison Zoo. She's there with the children's governess, Madame Montesquieu. With tears in her eyes, Josephine tells the child that one day he'll know the sacrifice she made for him. In a montage, we see the 1.5-year-old King of Rome, cared for by Mary Louise and Napoleon. Title: Defeat. On a Russian road, we see a French carrier, Major Phaidon, slowly moving, blocking traffic, more specifically a Russian carriage, in which the driver is ringing a bell to move faster or let him pass. Phaidon stops and opens the carriage to argue with the Russian gentleman. Phaidon is furious, stating that he's the official courier of Napoleon, and the law states that no one is allowed to pass. The Russian gentleman tells him that he's in Russia, so no law exists here. As soon as the road widens, the Russian carrier passes Phaidon, which enrages him so much that he pulls out a pistol and shoots poorly at the Russian carriage. Their narrator informs the audience that in 1810, relations between France and Russia were wearing thin. In a Kremlin office, Tsar Alexander tells Coligny court that he wants to break from the Tillis Treaty, for it is harming Russians just for the sake of weakening England for Napoleon's benefit. He concludes that he must break the alliance with France for the sake of his people, also to avoid an assassination like his father experienced, and is prepared to go to war with Napoleon.
I keep looking for things to say, but I'm like, this is Barry Lyndon. It just is like a lot of...
I will say, with the narrator explaining things that are happening, like the history is just like so dense.
Yeah. I mean, we'll get into this as well. This is an approach to telling a historical story that is not something I like, which is just, we've got to show all of the events that happened in this guy's life. And it's just like, no, we don't.
This is why war movies only take on like one battle.
Yeah. The best version of anything like that is like, well, we're going to focus on this one event or this one, moment. And that, to me, is more interesting. Stanley Kubrick trying to ask that question again about how to make a historical epic. This is not the way to do it, in my opinion.
No, it is not. Yeah. So, Tsar Alexander is about to break the treaty with Napoleon. In Napoleon's office, he prepares for battle, requesting typography books on Russia and Lithuania and details on Charles XII's campaign in Poland and Russia. Napoleon is seen on his hands and knees looking over a huge map of Russia. At Dresden Street, Napoleon met with Francis of Austria, Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia, and other kings to ask for their alliance against Russia. From the narrator, he states that here, on May 16th, were the last time he would appear as King of Kings. Prussia and Austria paid their respects to Napoleon, but declined to provide support in battle. With other royals, Napoleon convinces them that they will win the battle, and the best way to do so is to attack Moscow. Mm-hmm. At the back of the Vistula River, we see Napoleon accompanied by Berthier, Marat, Durac, Bessières, Davout, and 40,000 men, disguised as the Polish army. Napoleon's horse trips and falls with Napoleon on top. He jokes that this is a bad omen, but he carries on. It's 1812 when Napoleon leads his army to Russia. The sheer size of his army causes Russian forces to retreat multiple times as they invade. For Napoleon, he first sees this as a success and as an intimidation tactic, but Alexander is commanding Russian forces to destroy bridges, villages, and cities to make the land uninhabitable for Napoleon's army as they make their way through Russia. We see Russian soldiers set fire to abandoned homes just before retreating further. There are some small battles with the advanced French infantry and the Russian rear cavalry. In a scene, we see a small French army outnumbered by Russians 200 against 50. The French are gunned down after refusing to surrender. On an animated map, we see an overhead view of Napoleon's army marching through Russia in the summer of 1812. For the narrator, many of the Russians were impatient and thought that Alexander's strategy was reckless. Mm-hmm. Napoleon's army is still advancing and getting closer to Moscow. Alexander is ready to sue for peace, but one man, the governor of Moscow, I am going to refuse to say his name because I know I can't say it again, is about to change that. In his salon, the governor has a meeting with the head of the secret police and 11 senior Moscow officers. The plan is to set the city on fire, leaving nothing for Napoleon to conquer. Napoleon stands on the summit of Sparrow Hill, looking over the stunning skyline of Moscow. The French cavalry patrol Moscow to find that it's been deserted. The cavalry encounters a wild-looking long-haired man armed with a pitchfork. They laugh at him until the old man stabs one of them. They capture the old man, hold him down, stabbing him with their bayonets. They finally kill him when one of the officers shoots him with a pistol and accidentally injuring the hand of one of his fellow soldiers in the process. The next morning, Napoleon is awakened to find that Moscow is on fire. Baffled that the fire was started by the Russians and not by his own soldiers. From the accounts of the cavalry, this was planned and not an accident, spotting secret police officers setting fires all over the city. Napoleon realizes that this is very bad for him. We then see a montage of Russians setting fire to the city. The French soldiers are trying to attack them and stop them, with no success. At St. Petersburg Palace, we see Alexander, sick in bed, with General Kutuzov. Napoleon has sent Alexander a peace treaty. From the outside, Russians believe that Napoleon's army is to blame for the burning of Moscow, and they want revenge. Kutuzov informs Alexander that the fire was started by the Russian secret police, which Alexander doesn't believe at first. He also informs him that Napoleon's army is too weak to make it to St. Petersburg, and they can't afford to stay in Moscow through the winter and attack in the spring. He encourages Alexander to sign the peace treaty and allow Napoleon and his army to return home. Alexander requests a meeting with the cabinet to make a final decision. On a Kremlin balcony, Napoleon waits for Alexander's answer. Meanwhile, Murat and his staff are exchanging gifts with the Cossack officers and soldiers. Truckloads of letters are unloaded in the Kremlin courtyard from Paris. A French troupe of artists who happen to be in Moscow perform for the bored Napoleon and his officers. On October 20th, Napoleon decided to finally withdraw his troops. The narrator informs us that Napoleon waited too long and his army would be primarily lost by starvation, more so than the cold or in battle. French foragers, accompanied by cavalry, would have to search the scorched land for food as they march on their way back. In a scene, we see a French trooper having to shoot his dying horse. Other soldiers hear the gunshot ring and soon start lining up for food. One soldier carries his dog on his back. Another soldier asks if he can eat some of his dog. When he decides to cook him, the soldier is appalled at this request. They seek assistance from a small Russian village, but they are locked out. In a confrontation, a house is set on fire. Multiple French soldiers huddle around the burning home for warmth. Title: Invasion of France. January 1st, 1814. Napoleon is finally home, playing with his son around a still-standing Christmas tree as Mary Louise watches. The alliance has changed and turns against France and Napoleon. England, Russia, Prussia, and Austria have combined forces and plan to invade France. In a montage, we see enemy soldiers marching through the streets of French villages. Refugees flee from the conflict and villages are left empty. Some deserters that have been caught are arrested. Napoleon is frantically burning private papers and escorted via carriage. He kisses Mary Louise and his son goodbye. This would be the last time that he sees them. Napoleon leads a small army, marching them through the windy countryside to defend off the invasion. At a salon at Chatillon, we see leaders from both sides put together a peace conference to negotiate terms and end the fighting. In his headquarters, Napoleon is asleep in front of a fire. Maps strewn about, and his generals stand at a respective distance away from him. An animated map shows his dwindling army moving eastward. The hope was to bait his armies to march through Paris, where Joseph would carry out his orders and defend the city with his forces. On March 10th, Alexander was given a letter from Talleyrand stating that there is a lack of military preparations in Paris. Through another animated map showing Paris, Napoleon and his allies. Through the narrator, we learn that the enemy intercepted a letter Napoleon wrote to Mary Louise that revealed his strategy. Alexander would march to Paris, which would lead to the downfall of Napoleon's empire. A snowy road near Fontainebleau, we see French troops retreating as Napoleon in his carriage makes his way to the front to confront General Villard. Paris has been evacuated with no army to defend it. Only the National Guard stands at the gate. Napoleon charges ahead towards Paris, but his generals try to reason with him, telling him that there isn't an army they have to fend off the 120,000 plus enemy soldiers. Napoleon is furious. He's told of a treaty in which General Villard is not allowed back into Paris, and this only infuriates Napoleon more when he cannot be provided answers on the details on the new treaty or the location of Napoleon's wife, son, and his brother Joseph. Napoleon tries to rally a small army he has to defend Paris, but when he sees another column of troops retreating from Paris, he stops. He sits down on the side of the road, knowing that he's been defeated. Title: Elba. Napoleon pathetically marches Down Elba's main street, led by the governor, other city officials, and locals cheering him on. The narrator explains that the Treaty of Fontainebleau of April 1814 would result in Napoleon's removal from the throne and would be given sovereignty on the island of Elba. It wasn't an entirely bad deal. Napoleon was given the title of emperor, 2 million francs a year, and an army of 703 naval ships, which seems ridiculous that if you're trying to throw this guy away for being reckless, you end up giving him all that stuff.
Yeah.
In the next scene, we are at the garden party of Malmaison. Present there are Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia, Francis II of Austria, the King of Bavaria, Tsar Alexander, and Josephine. The narrator explains that Josephine would find herself in the center of Paris society and surrounded by royals from across Europe. But in 2 weeks, she would die of pneumonia. At the party, Alexander and Josephine walk alone together to talk. Josephine tells Alexander that he was the only monarch that Napoleon admired, and Alexander reveals that he's the reason why Napoleon was given a generous offer in the treaty, while other leaders wanted to leave him with nothing. Alexander also promises to take care of Josephine, and they embrace in a kiss. On a beach on Elba, Napoleon is lounging in a tent where he hears the news of Josephine's death. He can't believe it. In a long monologue, Josephine goes on to remember her fondly. He reveals that he's alone. His wife has been taken away from him by her father, along with their son. In the next scene, we see Mary Louise and General Neperg making love. He was her lover and had 2 children together before Napoleon's death. We see Napoleon's 4-year-old son playing with toys and soldiers in the palace. The narrator states that he would grow in isolation, ignored by his mother, and was chronically ill. He would die at 22. In 1814, we see Louis XV returning to his throne. We get a shot of Napoleon walking on the beach with his mother. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon set sail from Elba with his 700 soldiers. A crowd around him is writing down his proclamations. Napoleon marches with his troops until he's face to face with the French government troops, led by General Cannet. Napoleon is attempting a coup to take over the throne. Cannet informs his men of Napoleon's illegal grab of power, but Napoleon steps in and begins rallying Cannet's army. Many of them cheer for Napoleon, for he recognizes that these soldiers formerly fought alongside him, so they join him, and Napoleon is now back in power. So Napoleon has done a coup on France twice successfully. According to the narrator, the Congress of Vienna has passed, and the Allies refuse any diplomatic dealings with Napoleon and declare him a criminal beyond the protection of the law. Napoleon sits in the dining room of the Tuileries Palace, eating alone and reading a report. This is just a quick aside. So in the stage directions, Napoleon is eating bits of every food item in front of him, including dessert.
Okay.
So he just take little bits and just eat it all at once. So there's an account with Kubrick when Malcolm McDowell was working with him during the pre-production of A Clockwork Orange. And he asked Stanley why he was eating ice cream at the same time as a steak dinner. And Kubrick responded quickly with, "What's the difference? It's all food. This is how Napoleon used to eat."
Huh.
Yeah.
Weird.
Kind of telling.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to the script. He's told by his valet that Madame Everlon has arrived in his bedroom. He requests that she be undressed, and he'll be there soon. We cut to an animated map. It shows that the Allies are moving more than 1 million men to the frontiers of France. In June, the Prussian troops were defeated by Napoleon, and the German troops were forced to retreat. Unfortunately, Napoleon became ill, and many of the decisions were left to his generals. Because of this, there was no follow-up to the battles, and they were not decisive. Prussia was not out of the war completely, and the troops marched north. We are at the battlefield. June 18th, 1815, the French and British armies face off with each other at the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon is unaware that the Prussian army is just 10 miles south, ready to assist the British armies. Napoleon is in his headquarters looking over the map. He decides to wait until noon so that the ground would be dry enough to use his heavy guns. An animated map shows Napoleon's plan of attack. The French opened fire on the English troops. The English held their position in the Hargemont farm. During the battle, French generals spot Prussians in the distance, something they never expected. In a scene, we see Marshal Grouchy having breakfast when he hears gunshots in the distance. The narrator explains that if Grouchy had pursued the Prussians when they first retreated, they would have never assisted the British. But because they thought they left France, they were unaware that they would return. An animated map shows the arrival of the Prussian army, confirming France's defeat. In an inn, we see Napoleon seated in an armchair, head in his hands, still suffering from his illness. The battle is still ongoing, and Napoleon has left the battle decisions to Marshal Ney, who would continue to make more and more mistakes. In a scene, we see a line of French soldiers march to another line of British soldiers, only to be flanked by another line of British soldiers and getting slaughtered. More shots of the British artillery fire at the French. Dead men and horses are strewn throughout the battlefield. In a shot, we see a French colonel robbed by British soldiers and shot in the head. By 6 p.m. that day, Napoleon had come back to the battlefield to give orders. Ney is covered in mud and bloodstains. Napoleon deploys 5 battalions from the Guard Reserve, but this fails. The British charge, and the French soldiers have no choice but to retreat. Ney tries to charge back into battle and tries to get the retreating soldiers to join, but they don't, which is actually just a really funny scene of like General Ney, he realizes that he messed up entirely. Everyone else is retreating, and like, I forget exactly the scene, but he has like a sword or something, and he's like charging back into battle as like the lone soldier that's trying to take on the British army. He's like, I got this. We're gonna fight him. And everyone's like, no, we are done for. Yeah. So he tries to go back. Surprisingly, he has lived through this battle, but he was later executed by treason. Title, Saint Helena. Napoleon is on the deck of the Northumberland. The narrator explains that he surrendered to England and that he was sent as a prisoner to the island of St. Helena. He would live the remaining 5 years of his life there. His house was made of reconstructed cattle sheds. His home is infested with rats. Napoleon would dictate his memoirs to Count Bertrand. He would walk onto the buff overlooking the Atlantic while he was being closely watched by British soldiers. In his bedroom, a very gray and ill Napoleon is being examined by doctors, claiming that he had diplomatic disease. Just an aside, this wasn't in the script, but we now know that Napoleon most likely died of stomach cancer, which was exacerbated by a bleeding gastric ulcer.
Gotcha.
It also didn't help that he was being fed mercury as medicine. Bertrand sits by Napoleon's side as he lies sick in bed. He tells him that he had a vivid dream about Josephine. She was sitting in the room with them and told Napoleon that they would be together again. We cut to a shot of an unmarked grave. Napoleon died on May 5th, 1812. Just an aside here, but there's a dispute on whether or not the grave should read Napoleon Bonaparte or just Napoleon. And that's the reason why they didn't mark it.
Oh,
so that's why it was left unmarked. It wasn't like a disrespect thing. They just did not know what to put on the gravestone.
Interesting.
And they just kind of left it blank.
So they just didn't put anything.
Yeah.
Huh.
Also not included in the movie is that Napoleon's remains, it was on St. Helena for a while, but it was later moved to Paris, France, into a tomb in 1840. The construction of that tomb was later completed in 1861, and you can visit Napoleon's tomb today.
All right.
The very last scene in the movie, we cut to Napoleon's mother in her bedroom. And on the floor, we see the teddy bear that Napoleon slept with as a child.
Okay. As soon as I heard that teddy bear at the beginning, I was about to make some Rosebud joke. Gosh, and the fact that it comes back. All right.
So here's the thing, is that when I put together the synopsis, I left the teddy bear out. And then that scene came back at the end, and I was like, fuck!
I gotta come back to
I gotta
this.
put it back in.
Oh my gosh. Okay, sure. I'm already inclined to dislike this movie just because I'm not as into Stanley Kubrick already, but also like this historical epic thing is hit or miss for me. And then just to have that be the final button makes me just fully be like, okay, Kubrick. Here's the thing, that Kubrick quote about the way to do a historical biopic. Is it easy for you to find that quote again or read that quote again, Dan?
Yes, I have the quote.
Okay.
I start from the premise that there has never been a great historical film, and I say that with all apologies and respect to those who have made historical films, including myself. I don't think anyone has ever successfully solved the problem of dealing in an interesting way with a historical information that has to be conveyed. And at the same time, getting a sense of reality about the daily life of the characters. You have to get a feeling of what it was like to be Napoleon. At the same time, you have to convey enough historical information in an intelligent, interesting, and concise way.
So he's saying two conflicting problems is you got to show the day-to-day life of what it's like to be this person, but also you have to say all of this historical information. Here's my solution to that problem is don't say all of that historical information. We don't need it. For me, the most interesting biopics, the most interesting based off of a true story stuff is when it is one part of somebody's life or just like focusing on one detail and using that detail to explore more of who this person was like. The Lincoln biopic, which I haven't seen since it first came out, but I feel like that was successful because it's like, hey, we're not going to say all of the events of his life. We're going to focus on this 1 week of trying to pass this one piece of legislation. The Steve Jobs movie, which I have some problems with for different reasons, but the main conceit of that being, hey, this is just going to be backstage before 3 different product announcements. That was a really interesting way to tell the story because you are able to use this one event as a microcosm of what this person is like. And it's kind of like the more specific details you put, the more relatable the story becomes. Movies that get really relatable oftentimes like have some really specific details that aren't necessarily relatable. Like think about the movie Boyhood. There's a lot of people, myself included, who watch that movie and go, oh my goodness, I feel like I'm seeing my life on screen right here. This feels real and feels relatable, and I feel like I can relate to this person. It's not because the details are the same. In fact, putting in details are what makes that movie relatable. You know, putting in the detail of him watching a cartoon of Dragon Ball Z. You know, I didn't watch Dragon Ball Z, but something about that moment felt relatable to me and felt real to me. I feel like it's the same kind of mentality that you got to take with these historical movies is you don't try to skiv the entire life. You choose one portion, one important moment, or it doesn't even have to be an important moment, and you use that to show the character and the person, and that will make a movie that feels more true, even if it doesn't have as many facts in it.
Yeah. There's definitely moments in there where you can kind of like pick and choose, and you can make a movie out of those elements.
Yeah.
I mean, given that Kubrick had cataloged all of Napoleon's life, you can take those elements and really make something interesting. So like there's been plenty of stories just about the Battle of Waterloo. There's War and Peace, which is all about the French army invading Russia. But like something that I thought and really clung on to was the relationship between the Tsar Alexander and Napoleon.
Yeah,
and their friendship, and I really like that.
And maybe you can just take that one thing as your story to tell, as opposed to having to hit every single event. I feel like you get more out of watching Get Back than you would out of a Beatles documentary of the same length, because it's this one truncated space of time, so you actually get to know these characters, get to know these people, you know?
Yeah. I know that he was trying to put a big emphasis on Josephine, but every time she would come into the picture, I'm just like, it's not interesting. Like, that's his muse. I get that.
Yeah.
He's infatuated with her. He wants her no matter what, whatever the cost may be. And it doesn't work. I'm sure like the relationship in real life doesn't work.
Yeah.
We didn't need to make that as heavy-handed.
Yeah.
Like if it was going to be a love story of or even just a relationship story of Josephine and Napoleon, make it just about that. And maybe I would just be interested in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because then you're exploring a side of Napoleon that most people don't know about. Everyone knows Napoleon as the Emperor of France. They know him as this great general, this guy who led armies to victories. No one really knows about his love life.
Mm-hmm.
Or, you know what? How about just a movie about Napoleon in Egypt? That just small aside was just so interesting that I had no idea that he went to Egypt. I had no idea that he led a bunch of scientists and artists and intellectuals down there to essentially start digging up all of these artifacts and studying hieroglyphs. And the knowledge that we know of Egypt, I can't confirm this, but like it probably stemmed from Napoleon being down there.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's so many like little bits and pieces of what makes Napoleon interesting. And the problem is that we're so bogged down by everything being included. And that's not necessarily what we're interested in.
And you don't got to do that.
No, we don't. Let's start going into what happened.
Why did this not happen?
Why did this not happen get made? Weirdly enough, it's actually a similar situation as to what we see now with Warner Brothers today.
Okay, interesting.
In 1969, investor Kirk Kerkorian bought 40% of MGM. With that, he hired new management and reduced the studio's output to making just 5 films a year.
Wow.
So Napoleon was simply dropped to cut costs.
Wow.
Because of Kirk, he expanded the company from being just a film studio and started building casinos and hotels under the MGM name.
Oh my goodness.
That's why we have the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, is because of him. Yeah. Looking at the money that was spent, it doesn't seem too outrageous to cancel the movie because it was too expensive. Just in pre-production, MGM already spent $420,000, and the budget was estimated to be about $5.2 million, which is about $47 million today.
Yeah.
Knowing Kubrick, though, he's never under budget and would probably have doubled the cost of the film.
Yep.
But still, the real nail in the coffin was with the 1970 Dino De Laurentiis film, Waterloo.
Goodbye, my soldiers! Goodbye, my sons! Goodbye, my children!
A film about the battle between France and England and the fall of Napoleon. See, that's how you do it. Even though the film did well in the box office, it did not make enough money to make up for the production costs. Around 1970, United Artists considered picking up the tab, but after Waterloo, they passed. There was still a proposal letter that was found written by Kubrick dated on October 1971 about revising Napoleon after the completion of A Clockwork Orange. It's unknown who it was for. In the proposal, it states that a new script would be written. He states that it's because it has new ideas, which is not false, but it's possible that a lot of the rights of the original script was tied up with MGM copyright ownership.
Oh, interesting.
And they would have to change it enough to cut ties with them. The research did not go to waste. Some of it was used to influence Barry Lyndon, which came out in 1975. I know we both watched Barry Lyndon.
Yeah.
A lot of the elements that I saw in Napoleon, I definitely saw in Barry Lyndon. Like we saw the title screen stuff. A lot of narration. It was a period piece. And this I can't confirm, but I would not be surprised because they were filming all over Europe. I would imagine that a lot of the scouting locations that they found for Napoleon, they probably recycled and used in Barry Lyndon, especially because there's a lot of like battle scenes in there too.
Yeah, absolutely.
In March 2013, Steven Spielberg with Ang Lee announced that they would be producing a miniseries based on Kubrick's script with the permission of Stanley Kubrick's family. It helped that Steven Spielberg was given permission to direct AI, a film that was originally going to be directed by Kubrick, but then was handed off to Spielberg so that he could make Eyes Wide Shut. On May 2016, HBO announced that they would be producing a miniseries based on Kubrick's screenplay that was going to be directed by Cary Joji Fukunaga. He did True Detective and Beast of No Nation.
Yeah.
Neither project came to fruition. HBO did produce a War and Peace miniseries that premiered in 2016 that seems to be unrelated to Kubrick's Napoleon. An adaptation of Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon was successfully produced. It was actually French opera singer and actor David Zarathustra. He adapted the screenplay for the stage, in which he portrayed Napoleon, in which he became the human embodiment of the Napoleon complex. The play premiered August 23rd, 2018 in New York City. There is a medium in which the film does live on, similar to Jodorowsky's Dune proof of concept book. So Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon, the greatest movie never made, is a 24-pound book with 9 smaller books inside of it. The book is a limited edition published by Teskin in 2011. I want you to actually look up this book because it's pretty interesting. They only made 1,000 copies and initially sold them for $1,000 each. Last I checked on their website, they were completely sold out. The book contains much of Kubrick's research, location scouting photos, all the research pictures, costume tests, correspondence with historical experts, storyboards, treatments, and scripts.
Yeah.
If any filmmaker wants to take on the task to create Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon, ultimately they could. Teskin did make a less expensive version of the book that's only just one book that contains photocopies of everything contained in the original collection. It is listed for $80, but it is also sold out. And any copies that are out there are selling anywhere from $100 to $500 a piece.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. And then lastly, I just want to leave it on this note because doing all this research, learning about Napoleon, learning about Stanley Kubrick, it's not hard to notice the similarities between Napoleon Bonaparte and Stanley Kubrick. They were smart, strategic, obsessive, and headstrong. The fact that Kubrick never got to make this film is an epic poem in itself, much like Napoleon's life.
Yeah.
That is Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon.
I can respect some of what was trying to happen there, but I think even for the case of Stanley Kubrick, it's better that it didn't get made. I think Kubrick made these kind of big epic films, but I think Kubrick loves the details, and I think the story that he was trying to tell was too big for the details to really be able to matter. And I kind of felt that with Barry Lyndon, which the thing with Barry Lyndon as well is that you pointed out how long that duel sequence is. Yes, it's long, but it's also, for me, the most interesting part of the movie because there are details there that are interesting as opposed to going over all of these big events, you know?
Yeah, it got bogged down in the details. We both have the consensus that we probably would not watch this movie. I think because of the time, making this into a movie does not serve this story well.
Yeah.
And had the idea of a miniseries, or if television shows were just up to par with how movies look, like it is nowadays, if you had the time to really sit down and make this into a miniseries, I think you can make something interesting. And you can include all of the details. But the thing is that each episode can specifically focus on a different element. It doesn't have to work in a way that is linear.
Yeah.
Like you could have one episode that's just focused on his relationship to Josephine.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have an episode that's focused on his relationship to Tsar Alexander. And I think you could do something really great with that. Or even just his upbringing, like when he was in school being made fun of and you're just like, oh, this is what this kid is. is that he grew up different and he found a way to stand out and make himself important. Making this into a movie doesn't serve the story well. You're having to throw so much information in such a small amount of time. I mentioned before, like Steven Spielberg and Ang Lee were going to make this into a miniseries because they understood the assignment. They understand that, hey, you can't make this into a 3-hour-long epic movie.
Yeah.
No one's going to want to sit down and do this. But like a miniseries, it's going to work if they do it that way.
I agree wholeheartedly.
That's Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon.
All right. Well, I guess that's going to go ahead and wrap up this episode. So thank you, everybody, so much for listening. If you want to find more episodes of this podcast, you can go check out our website, pipedreampodcasts.com, which is also the home of Come On Fahugapods, Pod Made You Special, and Escape from Vault Disney. While you're there, you can check out links to our social media pages. We're on Instagram at How Did This Not Get Made? We're on Twitter at HDTNGM, and you can also send us your emails, notgetmade@gmail.com. If you haven't ever followed us on social media, you are missing out because Dan puts a lot of extra work into those social media pages, putting up pictures of concept art or other, historical details and a lot of stuff that ties into, what we're talking about, including every now and then unearthing some picture that takes the internet by storm because, hey, this person was this person's roommate? What?
Yeah.
Definitely go check that out. You can also find our Patreon page there. We're so thankful for our Patreon supporters. At that Patreon page, we have a couple of different tiers that include extra monthly bonus shows, ad-free versions of this show, access to our archives ad-free, Dan's notes, so much more at that Patreon page for this show and our other podcasts. That's going to go ahead and wrap us up. So thank you, everybody, so much for listening.
Thank you.
Where's the commies, the cage monster? They say I'm short and I got the lands, but check out my massive battle plan.